Hello and welcome to the third Science Café, where science meets practice and where we try to move from controversies to solutions. This year, the topic of the Science Café is fragmentation and national unity, narratives versus realities. What does national unity mean in the Kurdish context? How fragmented are we really? How can national unity be achieved in the sense of consolidating and expanding Kurdish achievements? We are discussing these issues today with Selma Irmak, former HDP MP, living now in Germany, and Professor Assistant Nilay Özok-Gündogan from Florida State University in the US. Thank you very much to both of you for joining this panel. And let's start with the scientific aspect of this issue. Nilay, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're situated right now. And thank you, Kurdakat, for inviting me to talk about this very important and timely issue. And I really like the fact that you have two components to this question: narratives, maybe discourses, and also the reality itself. I studied political science, but then I switched to history. I think the realities of the political circumstances, it was just too hard for me to handle as a scholar, so I switched back to the study of the past. But I am always thinking the study of the past in relation to what we have right now, because our questions, our approaches and methodologies, they all come from what we see right now. Historians do not live in a vacuum, so our notions of history kind of related to our present. Now, this issue of unity, like when we say unity, we have political unity in mind and maybe national unity, and fragmentation. It has been like a constant constant theme in Kurdish history and Kurdish politics. And there are various reasons for that, and it comes from the history of Kurds and Kurdistan. Now, in this talk, I'm not gonna talk about the contemporary situation. My intention is not to give a recipe for what we have right now or what we can do to achieve unity in a better way. My intention is to kind of think about the past and the present in relation to each other. What are some of the cases, issues that we have in the past or in the history of Kurds and Kurdistan that affect our interpretation of the present, interpretation of the contemporary political developments? Because the past and present are always, they feed into each other. What I mean by this is the issues, the problems that we have right now, that we have to deal with at the present, inform our understanding of the past. And when we have like a particular understanding of Kurdish history and Kurdish past, that in turn informs our understanding of the present. So these are really interrelated, they feed into one another. So a few questions that I have in mind: how should we approach the question of national unity or political unity within the context of Kurds and Kurdistan? And the related question is, what are some of the narratives that are existent out there when we think about the possibility for political unity among Kurds? Because everybody has a different perspective on this, right? We have different ideas, we have different political positionalities, but these ideas somehow, in my mind, they come from a certain understanding of Kurds, Kurdish political subjectivity, and Kurdish political agency. So I will try to make this discussion a little bit more concrete down the road by referring to particular instances and episodes in Kurdish history. But I really want to invite all of our audience to think about this very fundamental question. What comes to your mind when you think about Kurdish unity, like political unity? How do you describe it? What are some of the obstacles that you think stand in front of the Kurdish population and Kurdish political elites when we think of political unity as something that we cannot attain, something that we cannot achieve? So the point that I have in mind here is that I think when we think of political unity, we mainly focus on some historical episodes, which in our minds represent unsuccessful story. So I will clarify that a little bit. So in order to talk about the past and the history of Kurdish political agency, we go back to certain political moments, certain significant episodes, and we portray them as, in essence, like inability of the Kurdish political elites to get together for some reason or the other. And then in our mind, there's this linear path, like it comes from a particular political moment, and all the way up to this point, it kind of is like a story of inability to create political unity. And then we seek for answers. For better or worse, there are moments, of course, in which the Kurdish political elites were not able to form unity. And territorial unity is also another thing. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by unity and why is that? Why do we pose this as a question? Why do we have this panel? What is the reality out there that forces us to talk about political and territorial unity as a question that the Kurds and Kurdish political elites have to deal with? Now, the first aspect of this reality is, of course, territorial dividedness, right? When we talk about Kurdistan, we talk about the historic land of Kurdistan that's on which the Kurds lived for several millennia. But when we look at the reality, certain political developments in the past, I would say 4 centuries, resulted in the dividedness of the territory itself. Now, there are different approaches to this. Well, we might explain it as Kurdistan as a colonized geography, or for others, it is, for Ismail Beşikçi, for instance, it's an international colony and it has a uniqueness to it because it doesn't have just one colony. It has different nation states colonizing the historic land of Kurdistan. So the reality, the real question that is in front of us is, of course, territorial dividedness, right? Historic land of Kurdistan being under the government of 4, for some even 5 different nation states. And when it go back to the initial question that I posed, when we think about political unity or lack thereof, there's a lot of explanations about the Kurdish sociopolitical organization. A lot of observers, scholars, academics, or journalists, or even Kurdish politicians, they often refer to the tribal structures, like Kurdistan and Kurds primarily having tribal structures, and these tribal dividedness itself resulting in a lot of tribal feuds and being an obstacle for political unity because tribal loyalties and tribal alliances basically prevail over any type of modern political identity. So that is also another assumption. But the other thing is, of course, the international system, international state system, as particularly for the period after World War I. Where do the international powers stand with respect to political unification of Kurdistan? And of course, international actors are not trivial in different time periods of history, from World War I to interwar era, to the Cold War and the Gulf War era, and then its aftermath. The changing international conjuncture, of course, affects the maneuvers and abilities of the Kurdish political actors to make decisions and to make choices. Now, these are the realities, right? We all know that Kurdistan is a colonized geography. We also know that there are tribal structures in Kurdish society and whatnot. But what I want to kind of emphasize here in the rest of my talk today is 2 things. One is, as an historian, I would like to go back to some key moments in Kurdish history and invite you to reconsider why we should see these moments as not necessarily a failure or a missed opportunity, but as the realities of this context, like political divisions, international powers, sociopolitical organization, that lend themselves into the particular decisions that the Kurdish elites had to make in particular historical circumstances. So in order to do that, no worries, I'm not gonna go over the entire Kurdish history, so I'm not gonna kind of like talk about the things that you probably know. But what I wanna achieve here in this short talk is to how can we recalibrate or reconsider our narratives by looking at these particular moments in Kurdish history. And of course, any textbook account of Kurdish history will tell you that the 16th century is a very important time period in the historic division of Kurdistan. And the narrative here is based on the, of course, the idea that because Kurdistan was a frontier region or a borderland between two imperial powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, and mainly consisting of tribal confederations and emirates or principalities, meaning, you know, not imperial states, but decentralized structures. These Kurdish principalities or emirates really kind of played a proactive role during this critical imperial war between the two imperial powers. Now, I want to kind of add a few things here to have a better sense of how to assess or how to evaluate the options that the Kurdish political elites back in that distant time in the 16th century, which we consider as really as a significant turning point in the colonization of Kurdistan. Now, the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, they were really formidable entities at the time. They had really structured military organizations and fiscal organizations. They, maybe if I can explain it one metaphor here, a very famous historian of the Islamic world, Marshall Hodgson, he has this analogy. He says that if a Martian, like someone from the Mars, came and see the lands of the Middle East or the Islamic area or the entire globe at that time, he would have thought that the entire world was becoming Muslim at the time. He makes this point referring to these really powerful imperial structures, mainly the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal Empire. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because Kurdish principalities at the time constituted this border area between these two formidable empires. And given the circumstances, the arrangements that they came up with the two imperial entities at the time, as someone who works on this period, if you ask me, was quite strategic and quite effective because given the circumstances, Kurdish elites were able to get a kind of like an imperial understanding that they wanted to maintain their autonomy. That's why we talk about this period from around the 16th century until the 19th century as a period of Kurdish noble families maintaining their autonomous role in their territories. Now, the other thing is, we often talk about Idris Bitlisi. Idris Bitlisi was the Ottoman diplomats, if you will, who tried to like build that deal between the Kurdish principalities and the Ottoman imperial state. But now, when we look at the current understanding of this time period, we have this narrative of failure that Kurdish elites had to kind of submit to the authority of these states. We even have very ahistorical accounts of the role of Idris Bitlisi himself as someone ethnically being Kurdish, but working for the Ottoman state, because we consider this period from the lens of our contemporary sensibilities, how we see politics right now, how we see the political elites and their actions at the present. Now, so that's a very important turning point in the territorial dividedness of Kurdistan, but I would not say that there is like a linear story here from the Kurdish principalities losing their political agency and territories until the present, until what we have right now. Now, the second important turning point for understanding Kurdish political dividedness or lack of political unity is, of course, the period of World War I. And but prior to that, Kurdish political elites were changing. From around the 19th century onwards, one underlying theme that we have to emphasize is, of course, the making of the modern state. What we mean by the making of the modern state is that a political entity that is trying to basically control the previously autonomous parts of the empire by instituting tax policies, centralizing tax structures, standing armies. So the autonomy that we have been just talking about started to change in the 19th century, and the Kurdish elites were not really just passive observers of these processes. Different Kurdish political elites were trying to resituate themselves in this changing world. So all of us, I mean, I'm sure among the audience, most of you would be familiar with the Mir Bedirhan's story, right? That he was trying to he led a revolt against the Ottoman state, but then he had a claim to statehood. He minted money, and so we have this story in the back of our minds. But what we don't know here is the other elites. There is like a variety of other political groups that really incorporated into the Ottoman world with ease. They became Ottoman administrators, and then they pursued their political projects, whatever it was at that point, under the Ottoman administration. So, but coming to the World War I, what we have here often is described as what we would talk about back in the 16th century. We assume that Kurdish tribal structures don't change. They don't transform over time. They are just static entities. Kurds consist of tribal feudal entities, and they are just like that, and they never are affected by the broader and macro political changes happening around them, which is not true. In the late Ottoman Empire, we know that there was active Kurdish political cultural associations, political associations, and activities. We know that there were efforts toward like considering Kurdistan as a territorial entity and Kurds as the inhabitants and the historic indigenous populations of that territory. And coming to the World War I context, now in front of Kurds, there is like a very difficult situation because it is a very drastic transition from an imperial entity into a nation state structure. Now, we often think that, well, Kurds failed to have a state because of the dividedness. And I'm sure I will have opportunity to dwell on this a little bit more in the Q&A session. But in our previous Lausanne meeting, I briefly talked about that. We often unfairly judge the actions of Kurdish historical elites by assessing their choices with what we have right now, or with what we know right now, or the abilities that we have right now that they did not have at the time. And when I look at the period from around 1914 all the way until, I would say, like the Ararat revolt in 1930, Kurdish political elites really constitute a very dynamic entity from across the board, like different backgrounds, different political backgrounds, different political ideas and ideologies, but very active. It is, if you ask me, like when I look at the Kurdish political elites and their activism, it's a fascinating picture. And what is important here is that we go back to our original point. The territory was being divided. And not only the territory was being divided, but Kurdish political elites were being uprooted from their territory in multiple ways. For instance, during World War I, we know about the Armenian tehcir or Armenian genocide. We know that the Armenians were uprooted from the territory, but we don't know much about the Kurdish political families, Kurdish political elites who were uprooted and sent to the other parts of the empire and lost their connections with their homeland. Similarly, around in the 1930s, when the border was drawn between the nation states, again, Kurdish political elites found themselves in an exile situation. But despite these problems, Kurdish political agency persevered. And I find that really fascinating. I find that really important. And the other turning point here, of course, is the Lausanne context, right? We talk about, because it was the, centennial last year, we talked a lot about Lausanne, but Lausanne did not give Kurds what they wanted, right? And when we talk about why Kurds actually lost their hope for statehood within the period from around 730 until the Lausanne Treaty, we come up with this idea of sometimes we emphasize role of religion as something that they identified themselves with the Ottoman and then the Turkish state. And then we talk about their dividedness not coming together against a shared enemy. So there are like a couple of stereotypical accounts of Kurdish political agency for this period, which I think really don't explain much, because the foremost determinant of statehood in this time period was access to the international support. First British, mostly British in the Middle East, and then the international community. And for Northern Kurdistan, for Bakur, Kurds lacked that. Because like by 1922, it was pretty obvious that for the British, the major agenda was Southern Kurdistan, and they really had nothing to do with Kurdish ambitions for statehood and whatnot. So these are some of the I think interactions between past and how we interpret the past and the significant historical episodes in our understanding of Kurdish political unity or lack of Kurdish political unity. But I want to continue with like another related point, because facts, we often think that historians just sit and unearth facts from a pool of information. That might be the case for some historians, but what is important here is that historical discourses are political. Historical discourses can be weapons against particular groups. They can be used towards particular ideologies and political projects. So when it comes to like the understanding Kurdish political agency and Kurdish political statehood, I, of course, follow like the contemporary political. I'm sure Selma Hanım will talk about what we have right now, what opportunities we have for Kurdish political elites and all of that. But when I read these existing narratives, how do we talk about Kurdish political unity and lack of Kurdish political or the fragmentation of Kurds? I am really puzzled by how Kurds themselves talk about Kurdish history and politics in a way that echo existing colonial discourses. So allow me to elaborate on this. So as you see in these all different historical episodes, I am able to explain what options the Kurdish elites had, what constraints they had to face, and what mistakes they made in particular historical context. But when we assess the role of the Kurdish political elites at the present or in the past, we lose our historical perspective. Let me just explain it that way. We often use the descriptions, stereotypes, or essentialist, culturalist explanations that are used by outsiders to talk about the Kurdish elites. We adopt them and we use them. What I mean by this is, for instance, Kurdish dividedness being related to Kurdish cultural characteristics, or Kurdish feudalism, or Kurdish tribal feuds. So these conceptions really emerged in the 19th century by the modernizing states to describe Kurds in a particular way so they can establish rule over them. Now, let me elaborate. When you go back and read the 19th century Ottoman documents, you will see that they talk about Kurdish tribal structures as a problem. As a problem because they associate it with backwardness, they associated with lack of civilization, they associated with everything that is anti-modern or anti-modernity. But they did not really know much about what a Kurdish tribe actually was, how it functioned, what was its internal ruling mechanisms, what was its justice systems, and on what economic basis they operated. And oftentimes, a colonial vision builds itself upon a notion that the colonized peoples are unable to change. They're not open to change. Always associate them with primordialism. They almost always, they ignore their political power, their political agency, and use really culturally essentialist characteristics to describe their political situation. It can be religion, it can be like the social organization, it can be tribes, but this is like colonial, the part of a colonial gaze. So, and it is very common in colonized societies where the ruling structures associate what is unknown to them with primitivism, like a primitive context, primordialism, being uncivilized, being belonging to a different time period that is not compatible with modernity. So my major point concerns here a notion of self-orientalism, meaning, can we describe Kurdish political elites across the board in different regions, in different time periods, and their motivations, their actions, and their strategies, without really internalizing these culturally essentialist gaze of the colonial structures? So Kurdish political elites from different political positionalities, they come with their own strategies, mistakes, and agencies, just like any other elite group. But when we talk about the issue of political unification and fragmentation, we kind of forget the complexity of the historical processes that create Kurdish political context as we know it right now. Now, the greatest example here I always like really to give, Arab world. Like we have about, well, depending on how you counted, like from between 19 to 22 Arab states. And these are entities that quote unquote achieved statehood. They did not achieve political unity on the basis of an ethnic identity, but they achieved what was the biggest deal in the 20th century. They achieved statehood. But can we just simply assume that like the political elites of these 20-something Arab states, they did everything right in the past century to achieve statehood? What were the circumstances that created the modern Middle East as a region in which there are multiple Arab states, but not one Kurdish state? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that if we look at each and every case of statehood in the history of the Middle East, we will see similar dynamics in the same time period. We will see that political elites are being trying to be allies with the imperial powers. Some of them successful, some of them are not successful. They are trying to kind of gauge the requirements of the international context. They are trying to sometimes suppress other elites from their own community to come up with like a more overarching political agenda. But why do we think that Kurds were like the story of Kurdish non-statehood, let me put it this way, that the 20th century did not give the Kurdish population a state in their historic homeland? Can we just explain it as like failure? Or can we have the same grace? Can we have the same analytical tools that we use to explain this phenomenon of statehood in and outside the Middle East to explain what happened with the Kurdish political elites in these important turning points in the past 3 centuries or 4 centuries? Now, I think about this point quite often. There are 2 reasons for this. One is because I'm an historian and I closely interrogate significant turning points in Kurdish history. But the other reason is, of course, we have gone through and we are still going through important political transformations at the international scale and regionally that forces Kurdish elites to take positions, define their agendas, take sides, and reconfigure their priorities. So the question that I want to pose out there is, how do we make sense of Kurdish political elites and their choices and their strategies, not from a culturally essentialist, and I would dare say self-orientalizing point of view, without echoing that colonial gaze, but rather understanding the context, the obstacles, and the choices that they make in particular historical context. So I'm gonna leave it here, and I hope that I will have more opportunity to talk about some of these points in the QA section.
Thank you very much, dear Nilay, for this important and really excellent remarks. Now we will turn to the practice of this issue, and it's your turn, Selma.
Eji gohdarvanên me teva birêzarî silav dikim û ji Kürt Akad re jî spasiyê xwe pêşkêş dikim û serkeftinê dixwazim ku ev bername rêze bernameyan diweşînin û Nilay xanim gelek tiştên girîng got, ez jî dixwazim yanî dubare nekim lê tiştêk lê zêde bikim, temam bikim, belkim vî awayî hevdû temam bikin. Erê mere bixwaze gibi pêjî destpêkê de gotin ya jî têgeha netew em hinekî vekin, gotina netewê de çi pêk tê û ji bo çage em ser netewa Kurd û yekîtiya netewî ya Kurda biaxivin, em wan têgehana jî mecbûrin hinek ji nû ve weke Nilay xanim jî anî ziman ne wek em bêjin zanyariya an jî elmandina kolonyalizmê ji nû ve sazkirinekê em ji xwe re weke dihêla me jî dihêla hişmendiyê de jî ava bikin. Ji bo wê têgeh jî muhîm in, em wan têgehana jî ji nû ve saz bikin. Ez ê bêjim netew weke tê zanîn rastî ji destpêka kapitalizmê em karin bêjin destpêkirî heta roja îro her giçûye belkî hîn bi awayekî kûr û hinekî jî çawan bêjin bi çarçoveyekî hîn berfirehtir, cana jî hîn ziravtir hatiye meşandin ji ser milleta heta kesa weke kirasekî hatiye rûnişkandin. Em karin ji netewê re ji têgeha netewê re vêya bibêjin ji ber ku ji destpêka civakê û heta roja îro çand, huner, nasname û pevre jiyandin û çanda pevre jiyandinê li gora hereman tê guhertin, li gora çandê tê guhertin gelek netew an jî em karin bêjin çand di nav hev gelek cara de dipije ji hevdû gelek tişta distînin û gelek tişta jî didin hev. Cana li gora koçberiya dinyayê an jî bobelatên dinyayê an jî veguherandina demê û zaman ev çand cana ji holê radibe, belav dibe, reng diguherîne, yanî mere nikarin navekî esasî li netewê bike. Ji ber vê cana mere bibêjî gelo netew li ser esasê erdnikariyê saz dibin an li ser esasê ziman, yanî zimanekî hevpar saz dibe, an li ser esasê gombêjin dîroka rabirdû û bêjin xewn û xeyalê pêşî û bi ser vê ya ava dibe, an jî çanda jiyanê ya em bêjin jin û mêr û dawet û şîn û her wiha, yanî em karin bêjin ev tiştên gidişibin hev gelo li ser vana ava dibin. Yanî gotina netewî çi dihebîne hundirê xwe. Oxta gem binerin di dema destpêka jiyanê de ku jiyana komînal ku wek hev gel dijiyan di demên dewletê de jî heman tişt heye divir dem dinerin sînordayînekê tuneyê, yanî sînordayînekê ku ji bo ziman, sînordayînekê ji bo erdnîkariyê, an jî ji bo nasnameyê, an jî ji bo baweriyê zêde mere nabîne. Piştî dewletbûnê ev tişt pêk tê, yanî dewlet mecbûrekî سینور خو خیز بکی عدنگاری پارو بکی لگورا و عدنگاری جی کسین دهندر سینور دمانه جوان رناسنامه که هف پار ساز بکی و ای کل دربی وی سینوری مانه سینور دولت از بیجم او جی بناسنامه که دن بین بناف کرن و بیناسه کرن ایجا ev kesên di nav vî sînorê de helbet li gora çandekê tê dijîn li ser wê ednigariyê dijîn rast e ama bi perwerdekirina dewletê jî heman nirxan an jî hêmanan ji xwe re ava dike yani dewlet jî vana saz dike weke îro çawa dewleta Tirkiyê dibêje yek ziman yek al yek dîn yek welat her wiha evana em nikarin bêjin mîrataya û gotina dewleta Tirkiyê bixwe yê asas xwe gem bibêjin têgeha netew vana teva dundirê xwe de diparêze em li netewbûna mînak Fransa binerin ya Almanya binerin ya Belçika binerin an jî derdorên ku dewletên destpêkê de dibin netew bi zordarî nasnameyekê hevpar saz dikin bo wê li gor dîtina min têgeha netew jî di hundirê xwe de nakokiya dihebîne gerek em veya jî ji nû ve saz bikin tabii ez ne siyasetmedarim û ne akademisyenim belkî Nilay mamosteya Nilay di vî warî de hinek tişta ji me re bibêje me re kare ji nû ve çawa pênase bike ji bo ku em têgeha ya kapitalizmê ya kolonyalizmê ya heman deme ya emperyalizmê û dewletbûnê ku li ser mirova sergela fers kiriye û navê wê kiriye netew û gelek taybetmendî ji holê rakirî yani standartîze kiriye fîstanekî bi zorê li wan kirî ji wana gotin hûn mînak netewê Fransî ne netewê Almanî ne netewê İngilîzî an jî wekî dinin belkî vana me re ji nû ve dibêjin ya weke feminîzmê dibe yapı söküm ewlî ziman em ji nû ve saz bikin bo wê ez dibêjim wextak li ser nasnameya millet em bisekinin an jî gel em bisekinin ez dibêjim belkî hîn zêdetir daxwazê me bîne ziman ji ber ku erdnîgarî ne hîmekî netewiyê niha mesela Kurdistan çarperçeyê newsa hatiye çarperçe kirin sînor di navberê de hatiye ava kirin û ev sînorana heman demê li ser nasnameya Kurdan jî cudabendî ava kiriye bi xwezayî ava dibe yani tu bikî nekî ava dibe her dewlet li gora xwe em cana dibêjin ya lîteratûra me ya siyasî de em dibêjin her dewletekî mêtînger Kurdê xwe ava kiriye ew weka Nilay Hoca anî ziman gote elîtîstê Kurda bi rastî ev têgeh bi vî awayî dixwazim temam bikim yani elîtîstê Kurda nasnameya giştî ji hêla dewletê kolonyalîst de tîne ziman lê gel û civak ez dibêjim di ciyekî din disekinî lê ew elîtîstên xwe perwerde dike kedî dike û vediguherîne li gora nasnameya xwe li gora daxwaza xwe ne nasnameya xwe daxwaz û berjewendiyê xwe heman demê de cixta gem binerin yani serdestî çi qasî ji hev cuda bin jî çandeke hevparin yani serdest iktidarê illekî noktayekî hevpar li gel hev dibînin û bi vî rengî guherandina çê dikin îja ji wir em bên ser perçeyan helbet van perçeyana van sedemana anha mamoste jî rêz kir van sedemana Kurdan ji hevdû cuda kiriye lê em karin bêjin ev netew bûye çar netew na erê belkî ziman di hêla ciyekî de hatiye guhertin çand û huner û jiyan û em bibêjin her wiha hatiye guhertin berî her tiştî xalekê herî giringê baweriyê rojhilata navîn de herî ya ku bandorê li ser mirova dike ser çand û nasnameyê dike mezhebin baweriye newsa ev ji hev cudane ev jî Kurda ji hev cuda kirî lê dîsa jî ew erdnîkarî û ev parçebûn di hêla gel de di navbêna hev de honandinek çêkiriye em vana ji ku dibînin mamosta qala İdrîsî Bitlisî kir ez jî dixwazim qala Ehmedê Xanê bikim Ehmedê Xanê jî rewşenbîrekî wê demê ye û و دمجي دنابنا صافية ودنابنا بجن إيراني وعثمانية ده كرد بنا دو پرچه يعني دور دجي يكيتي بيكناي مخابن هناك شيعان هناك ام بجن سنين انجي دوی وارد جهف قطبن انجي هناك سردستن جخورا عشيري خوا كوم دكن وهناك دچن قال شاه يعني وزيري ويدمي وهناك لقال عثمانيان هاني دمينن دفر دجي دفتن دمي جدستي خوا برددن چی دبیجه احمد خانی د برهما خویا مموزینه ده مموزین اساس وک کردستان پیناسه دکه یعنی زین بخوا کردستان اساس و تاجدین و مم جبو کردستان هولکی دیدن تاجدین دگهش مراده خوا لمم باللیستوکن دستلاتدارا درناکه و سری و دور ده به استواری وندادک یعنی تکوشنه کم کارون سر روی دستانی گلک زیده بسکنن لیده انجامی ده احمد خانه ده بیجه یکی تیا کرده هگ بکنه و هگه وی یکی تیا بزانستی و به پیناسه که بناستامه که هفپار نه هوناندن اوی کرد هر تم یا دبن دسته فارسا دبن بن دسته عجما دبن بن دسته عربا آنجی ترکا دبن yani bin ve hale xezdiki u evji peywistiya yekîtiya gelê Kurd muhakkak tîne ziman û bin wê xêzikî yani ehemmiyeta wê dixwaze bîne ziman rewşan bîrên Kurd wir jî wî tiştî dixwazin pêk were yani dibê serkeftin û em bêjin xelasiya Kurda rizgariya Kurda di vir de yî heta gem veya pêknînin ji me re jî dewletek an jî serfiraziyek pêk nayê îja ez vana dixwazim وەکە دوو خاڵە بینم زمان لەگۆر نەرîنا me yekîtî em karin bi du hêla bîne ziman yek ya çandî nasnameyê hêla di hêla ziman de yani di hêla civakê de û yek jî yekîtiya siyasî û em niha ser nîqaşê dikin em dibêjin Kurd çima nebûn dewlet ez wisa difikirim ku yani di hêla wek ana me got çar perçe jî bûne Kurd lebelen ew hêstên neteweyî hêstê gelbûn Kurdbûn ji holê ranebûye yani Kurd dîsa hevdû hes dikin dîsa hevdû dibînin işte Ahmedê Xanê berî ana bi 400 salî nivîsan diye dîsa em karin bêjin melayê cizîre an jî feqiyê Teyran vana nivîsan diye an jî em mele Tahîrê Ürgan em karin zêde bikin rewşenbîrên Kurd di vir de jî oxta berhemê xwe de qala gelê Kurd dikin qala gelê Kurd tevahî dikin yani qala heremekê tenê nakin a di vir de ez dibêjim yekîtiya çandî ji holê ranebûye çi qasî hatiye astenkirin jî yani asimilasyon ve guherandin pek ne hatiye ji ber ku ew çandeke qedîme di koka wê gelekî xurt de ew ji holê ranebûye lê mixabin yekîtiya siyasî yekîtiya ya serdest yekîtiya iktisadî di vir de pirsgirêk heyî û di vir de yekîtiyek pêk nehatiye di vir de zatî mamoste Nilay gelek xweş anî ziman berjewendiyên jorîn û elîtîstên Kurda û berjewendiyên civakê her tim di navbêna hev de nekiliyayî yani di vir de em ez dibêjim em wenda dikin belkî di vir de carekê din em karibin bifikirin ku yekîtiya siyasî ji nerîna Çîna Kurda ya serdest jî pêk tê a dûwir de gerek em yani ez bêjim pirsgirêk dûwir de û gerek em hinekî li ser wir bixebitin îro jî ez naxwazim pir zêde dirêj bikim zatî mamoste gelek tiştanî ziman ka binerin wexta li vir em tevgera azadiya gelê Kurd bînin mînak bidin li gor dîtina min di gelek bername de jî me aniye ziman belkî hinek tevlî nebin lê ez wisa difikirim PKK bixwe ya rast em karin bêjin yekîtiya Kurda weke minyatûrekî pêk anî yani ne tene yekîtiya Kurda asas em karin belkî biskevdin ez qalawana jî bikim neteweke demokratîk çawa saz dibe di hundirê PKK de em karin bibînin ji her derê Kurdistanê, ji her bawerî, ji her nerîn, ji her ziman, heta ji her gel û milletî însan tevlî vê tevgerê bûn û di nav vê tevgerê de bi armancekê hevpar tekoşîn kirin. Nasnameya xwe ji nû ve saz kirin. Yani di nav vê tekoşînê de Kurd hene, Türk hene, Arab hene, Ermen hene, Suryan hene. Newsa yani milletê qedîm yê Kurdistan axa Kurdistanê dijîn tevahî tevlî vê tevgerê bûne bi heman arcî. Gelo ez hatim. Erî biborin dema ku telefon tê yani xud dibe ev jî mikinek kompîter pêk nehat mixabin. Erê weke ez bêjim weke netewekê demokratîk döndere pekekê de vî awayî saz bûye. Dîsa ez bixwe ji malbatekê Sunnî me û bi vê yani Müslüman û Sunnî me û Şafî me. Bi vê çandê mezin bûme her çiqas piştî ku tevgerê evana hinek di serê xwe de me veguheran dibe jî lê di jiyana xwe de nerîna min li hember êziya, li hember Elewiya, li hember em bêjin Xristiyan cihû an jî baweriyên din pir zêde ne firehbû ji ber ku di çanda malbatê de ez mezin bûbûm. Di çanda civakê û derdora xwe de mezin bûbûm. Lê di hundirê PKK de em dinerin ku êzîtî, Elewîtî, Xristiyanî, cihûtî an jî bawerî û mezhebên din di nav hev de dikelin. Yani ev erêniyan van baweriyan tevahî weke erênî û ez çawa bêjim yani hevpar kümülatif birikim em dibêjin ya yê civakê ye. Ev hebûna civakê ye ku bi hezar salan kom kirine û navê wan bi awayekî danîne. Kirine Êzîdî, kirine Elewî, kirine tişkîdîn, kirine baweriyekê lê ev hevpariya civaka xwezayî bi xwe ye. Em li ser vê felsefê ji nû ve me nerînê xwe saz kirin. Ji nû ve mer Elewîtiyê, Êzîdîtiyê, cihûtiyê, an jî mezhebên din ya resanî, kakayî ya û her wiha li ser vana em sekinin û mejiyê xwe me ji nû ve hişmendiya xwe me ji nû ve saz kir. Bo wê ez bêjim yani netewiya demokratîk ya herî weke mînyatûriya piçûk em karin bêjin di tevgera azadiyê de pêk hat. û îja niha em li Kurdistanê binerin hevalên hêja. Di Kurdistanê de çawa Bakur dest pê kir lê her derê Kurdistanê ciwan xwe li vê tevgereyê girtin. Dîsa dema ku şoreşa Rojava pêk hat ji her derê Kurdistanê ciwanên Kurdan, jin û mêrên Kurdan, kal û pîrên Kurdan û heman demê êvê erdnîkariyê xwe li vê erdê girtin û ji bo vê erdî ji bo azadiya vê perçê li ber xwe dan. Her wiha em li başûr binerin yani bi gazebekê mezin Saddam bi hezaran însan qetil kirin û heta hatin wê astê lê di wir de jî em dinerin gelek cudabûn hebe jî dîsa di hundirê hev de yek perçe ava bû û em jî pê kêfxweşin pê serbilindin ku ala Kurdistanê li ser perçak axa Kurdistanê ku bi navê Kurdistan tê binavkirin fermî li ba dibe û heremek navê wê Kurdistan û hikûmeta Kurdî ava dibe. Ew ji bo me Kurda tevahî rûmeteke, serbilindayiyeke, kêfxweşiyeke. Yani dibî warî de dibe ku rexneyê me şevdû re hebin, dibe ku tiştin kêm zêde hebin ew qelek dûr e yani ew qe nepirskirêk e. Ama wexta ji Kurdekî tu bibêjî ez bixwe dema yekemîn ku ez çûm başûr min ji Hewlêr û Silêmanê ke ez derbas bûm ala Kurdistanê carê yekemîn ku me li hewayê dî ji xwe berhêsrê min herikîn. Yani ji kêfxweşî cara yekemîn ku ew dît ew hês ez nikarim bînim ziman. Ji bo her Kurdî ez bawerim ew kêfxweşiyeke serbilindayiyekê. Dîsa li Rojava jinên Kurd اختاق بسركتن اول دنیای توا ناوی وان بلابو تکوشینا کردا بلابو از زانم وکا دلی خوکو کردک لکدری به کردکی کو جی کردیتی در کتبه جی به کیف خوش بو به سربلند بو هر وها لروشلات اختاق جنجیان آزادی لهمبر رژیما ایران یا کو ام بیجن غدار سکنین او تکوشینه که جنا پیک آنین اوج بو کردا توا بو سربلنداییه که او ایرو ام دیسا دبیجن دای که کردا دبرده دبیجن او کسین کو آخا خوینا خوا لسر و آخی رجاندنه او تب زاروکی منه اوج بو آخا کردستانی خوینا خوا رجاندنه چه پیشمرگنه چه گریلانه چه تشکی دنن اوانا زاروکی منه دبیجن یکی تیا دنابینا geldi دنابینا جواکی ده دهلا چاندی ده دهلا ناسنامهی ده یاراست لگور دیتنا من پیکاتیه و جوه ساعت پیوشی تو قوت و تو اسیمیلاسیون انجی پولیتیکاین kolonyaلیست نکارن و یکیتیه جهولی راکن لی تشتیگ امیل سر بسکنن یکیتیا سیاسیه ایرو روژی ماموستا آنی زمان چاوا ده دما لوزانه ده ما گلک تشت وندا کر جبر کو نونرین متونه بون ام لهمبر فن و فوتان و حیلان ام نگیهشتن و آسیکو ام زانبن چل پیشیامهیم yani ریبرین می کو دور ببینن تونه بون یکیتین مدناب yani aristokratın kurdan و mezneyin kurdan anji ریبرین kurdan de او دیگهشتن جی تونه بو مخابن yani ام çawa bejin bedirxaniyan em karin wan bi birêzdarî bi bîrtînin helbet tekuşine gelek mezin dan lê pişre bixwe yani çi qasî her kedekê jî bidin dibin baneya Osmaniyan de mixabin weke paşatî girtin û bi awayekî dîsa jî hatin surgûn kirin hatin kuştin û hatin ji dûrî welatê xwe hatin kuştin yani ew têgihêştin divê astê de kema de asla Çina ya jor ya Kurda de yani de hela hişmendi u reveberiye de İroji em dinerin başur minak em karin hükümeta Kürdistan'a federal ya heremi em karin binin zaman divi avide avayde hezeki mezine jibo Kurda perçak mezine و مشروعیتک و هی لسروی دنیای تی قبول کرن به آلا خوا به دولت خوا به ناسنامه به جیان خوا یا سیاسی و اقتصادی تی ناسین و مشروعه ev herem karij bo Kurdistan tevahi hewl bide kare nebançitiye bike karij bo aşti u jibo berjewendiyen gel hewleke mezin bide le mixabin Ya Rabbi ya ilahi. Biborin hevaleki bi ısrar digere. Eri ez dirêj nekim niha tiştê emêl ser bisekinin ji hêla PKK de jî û ji hêla hêzên başûr yenekê û Partî Demokrat û Yekîtî jî û ji partiyên din de jî û ji bo rojava Rojhilat û Bakuriyê Tirkiye jî pêwîst e ku siyasetmedarên Kurd rêberên Kurd û elîtîstên Kurd em karin bêjin yani êku civakê bi rêve dibin û îro siyaseta Kurda didin meşandin û di ciyekî de jî qedera gel di destê wan de yê ew yekîtî pêk were ji bo ew yekîtî pêk were ji jêr de ji gel de gerek em bandorekê li ser saz bikin weke akademisyen weke rewşenbîr weke hunermend weke civakên sivîl yên civakê komelên û saziyên civakê ez bibêjim di vî awayî yani ji jêr de em basıncekê li jor bikin da ku berjewendiyên gel carekê din ji bo berjewendiyên asla Çina jor ye Kurda tek neçe u dibin ve baneye de hayf u mixabin nebe. Eci tuazım vana bejim yani yekitiya siyasi jibo pek vere gerek em vaka civaki hin zedetir haul bidin u hin zedetir rayın xwe dengê xwe em bibêjin raya giştî îrada xwe deynê holê û guherandina pêk bînim. Ez jî vana bêjim weke temamkirina mamoste Nilay naxwazim dirêj bikim belkî bi pirsa em hîn berfirehtir bikin. Spas dikim ez jî.
Thank you so much, dear Selma, for this important and excellent remarks. Now it's time for the Q&A session. Are there any questions or comments from the participants here? You can also write your question into the chat. Okay, maybe I can start asking you, Nilay, because Selma mentioned an important question. How can we define a nation? How would you define a nation, Nilay?
Well, instead of how I define the nation, I think we can talk a little bit more about how nation was defined in different ways by different scholars, because what Selma mentioned is not like a conventional nationalist idea, because nations and nationalisms are products of modernity, and as she rightly pointed it out, it is the product of a particular type of capitalist modernity. Now, but when she talks about political unity, she's talking about an alternative vision that is emancipated from the inequalities, hierarchies, and oppression that comes with the capitalist component of modernity. But when we talk about nation itself, we approach it in different ways. For some scholars, nation is built on an ancient core, like an ancient attachment, an ancient ethnic, not necessarily ethnic, but some sort of bond that ties them together in a particular way. And then over time, within the context of modernity, that ancient core somehow lends itself into a nationalist project. For some others, nation is totally constructed. A nation consists of groups that might or might not have anything that tie them to each other than a nation state actually building that national identity. Now, so there are different ways to approach it, and I am not inclined to pick one or the other, because I think the idea, the analysis of what a nation is less important than the historical processes that created different types of nation states. That's what I think is really important. And as Selma mentioned, nation states were created in a certain point in history. They serve a particular goal in the largest project of capitalist modernity. So nations, we have so many different types of nations around the world, right? I mean, again, the best example here is the Arab world, right? You might think that there were in different time periods, there was like a pan-Arab sentiment. They wanted to go beyond the nation state boundaries and come up with like a pan-Arab idea. But the reality was that even though they spoke the same language, they still are different dialects, and there still are different economic systems. There still are different notions of religion and religiosity and secularism. So Darsim, maybe I haven't answered the question as clearly as you might like me to answer, because it is not as clear as we want it to be. But now maybe I can tie it to another point that I really wanted to emphasize, that somehow I just missed it in my initial conversation. It's actually related to what Selma Hanım's excellent points, which is how do we approach this question of unity? We can either approach it as analytical, from an analytical point of view, and understand what it was or what it was not in particular historical, political circumstances. But Selma Hanım's route was, and I'm really pleasantly happy, I'm pleasant to see that she focused more on the like the prescriptive notion of it. What do we want from unity? What should unity look like, and why it is important, and how can we achieve that? Now, I think the point that I want to emphasize here is that in our everyday conversation, in political discourses, in scholarly discourses, these two somehow get mixed. What I mean by this is our desire to see political unity somehow shape how we interpret the descriptive part of it, how things are in reality. Now, it goes back to your question, Darsim. What is a nation? I mean, I can't describe how nations were made, constructed in history in 200 different ways. But if we ask what a nation should be as a part of a political project, that's a whole different story. So we have two different analytical levels to make sense of these questions. What is unity? What should unity look like? Because as we talk about it in the past century, nation refers to, as again Selma Hanım rightfully mentioned, it's like the conventional nation-state model based on ethnicity, and it is, especially in the colonial societies, it more often than not imposed on these societies by larger actors and whatnot. But now, as she also mentioned, we are talking about a different type of unity that does not, or that should not necessarily reproduce the ills of capitalist modernity or the problems that come with the nation-state nationalisms. But there's also other levels to this discussion. I think I'm going back and forth between what I want to offer as an analytical exercise. How do we make sense of these categories? How do we use these notions in order to make sense of what is ahead of us? And also, what is our desire? Yani, what is in our heart for the Kurdish political future? And these two things are related, but not to be conflated. And maybe I can give an example from Selma Hanım's presentation, and kudos to the interpreter, by the way, translator. I truly appreciate the excellent translation that he gave us. So he gave the example of like Idris Bitlisi versus we have Ahmed Hani, right? We have that, and we have like these conventional, when I say conventional, like classical accounts of like Kurdish political writings and narratives. And you're absolutely right. It's not just that we project our notions to that time period. They do talk about the need for unity. But when they talk about unity, that's a desire. That is the prescriptive part. That is the political project that they are aspiring. But now in a hindsight, we can actually see what are the actual conditions that makes that desire really difficult to come into fruit, not because of necessarily cultural essential characteristics of the Kurdish society, but because of the fact that up until the 16th century, when centralized states actually become a thing in the region, Kurds maintained historically decentralized structures. So that the reality itself is important to understand what choices they had, because by the time they faced these two sizable imperial entities, they had been living in these territories in peace with their decentralized structure. So this is a political issue. This is not a cultural issue. This does not concern the cultural traits or characteristics of Kurds, but it concerns the fact that on the one hand, we have this Ottoman political military structure that is becoming extremely powerful in this time period, whereas the Kurdish political structures living in decentralized entities up until that point did not really strive to do that. Now, in hindsight, we might see that as an error. We might see that as a missed opportunity. But if we change our perspective, for instance, we might think that what did decentralized lifestyle propose to the Kurdish society? We know that Kurdish society was hierarchical, so was like their neighbors, But what did the decentralized structure mean for Kurds? What was their justice system? What was their gender systems? We talk about women and then its significance for the building of the oppressive structures in the region, but we don't know that much about that. We don't talk about what centralized structures versus decentralized structures offer to Kurds, why they were really hanging on to those decentralized structures for so long. So my point here is really, I'm not trying to factually offer something totally new. I just want to offer a different structure, because how we interpret our past really has a lot of bearing on how we see our society at large in our contemporary era. Now, yes, Ahmed Ahani also talked about unity, the need for unity, and how feudal dividedness was like an obstacle and whatnot. But did they have any opportunity, or did they actually have any need to be in a centralized structure until that point? They probably did not. They did not need that. And we know that like all these centralizing structures, they are in essence have certain oppressive mechanisms. So are we saying basically that they missed an opportunity for something they did not initially need for? So again, like for each and in each time period, for each critical turning point for Kurdish history, from the 16th century to the 19th century, a modernization, from that to the World War I. And I think we should talk more about the Cold War context on Kurds, which we don't do that often, which is also very critical. In all of these cases, yes, we have to kind of like try not to conflate these two dimensions. One is like analytical, understanding the challenges, understanding the constraints, but also, which is something very important that Selma did, like prescriptive. What are the ways to achieve unity right now? And there is like, often we approach history, and this is how history is taught at school, right? That we have to learn from our mistakes. I don't think that's really true. We can't learn from our mistakes because those mistakes belong to a different time period. So we cannot repeat those mistakes because those circumstances, those structures can't be repeated as they were. So I, as an analytical lesson, I really value this. Like, yes, we have to imagine unity. We have to aspire for that. But I think it also has to, I really liked Selma Hanım's remarks about in Bashar, there is a political entity. For better or worse, there are political problems, but yes, there is recognition. And one question that I think has to be an essential component of these debates on Kurdish political unity is dignity and pride. And yes, they, as you say, like seeing the Kurdish flag, that gives people pride and dignity. And it is really important. And that vision is, I think, important to understand what is it that we are aspiring for. So, and there are two levels. Unity, what does unity entail? How do we achieve that? But again, what is the nature of that unity? What are going to happen to the other hierarchies, like gender differences, ethnicities, religion? Really important points that Selma Hanım made during her talk. And I think for me, going back to your original question, the key point is to really try to not conflate these analytical and prescriptive, or analytical or idealist views of what unity was and what it should be.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is the question for both of you in the chat. I will read the question. First of all, Hevin said, thank you very much, dear Nilay and Selma. Her connection is not very good, so she decided to write her question. Thinking about what both of you said, I'm wondering what you both think about different strategies for bringing together the big scale political dynamics, for example, the history of several colonialism, etc., and the solidarity within the people on the ground through politics, arts, etc. And thank you both, she said. Maybe Selma can start. And Selma, if you want to add something to what Nilay said regarding my question about the definition of a nation, you
Lepers
can
از
do
tam
it too.
tene giyiştim. Tukare ne ki Bu Kurda ne olsa siyasi dine. Hı hı. Evet. Ya. Evet. Hı hı, hı hı. Evet. Yani dixwazim ew li pirsa Dersim gibi bêje ji bo ev dinamîkê siyasî gelo me re kare çi bike. Yani ez bawerim zatî niha pirsgirêka me yan jî nîqaşê me ku em yani lê pirsînê dikin yek jê ev e ya girîng ew e weke manî zimanyanî Kurd di hêla civakî de di çandî û dîroka qedîm de û îro sibêje ez wisa bawerim di wir de yekîtiyekê hestî pek anîne. Yani Kurdek li ku derê êşekê bikişînî em pê diêşin. Kurdek li ku derê serkeftî bî resamek heyî işte hunermendek heyî li derekê dinyayê Kurd e bi Kurdî tiştekî dibêjî em Kurd tev pê kêfxweşin. Yani ew asas yekîtiyekê netewî ye di vî awayî de me re kare pênase bike li gora wê. Lê dîsa ez dixwazim doka dubare bibêjim ya di hêla siyasî de İja di salên sed sala bîstan de gel em karin bêjin pir zêde tevlî rêveberiya civakê nebûye. Yani ew derfet pêk nehatiye. Rêveberî her tim ji bo Çîna serdest pêk tê. Yani Nilay mamoste jî anî ziman yani şêxin, begin, ağane, em bêjin mezê eşîretan û eşîretin yani li gora eşîret û mezinbûnê yani li gora esaletê em karin oka nav nenûkê de em bibêjin ew rêveberin. Yani dewletên kolonyalîst jî ki mihetab digirin dîsa ew sinifin, ew kesin. Yani gel ne nav vê rêveberiyê de yê. Gel tenê belkî bi leşkerî di şer de alîkariyê dike, belkî bacê dide, wêrgiyê dide bi awayekî. Lê wîna gel pir zêde em nabînin yani nakevin navîkarî. İja îro ro em dibêjin îdî tevgera gelê Kurd tevgereke modern e. Hem deme. Ev tişt ji bo gelê Kurd ez bêjim derxistiye holê. Yani demokrasiya di navbêna Kurda de ev sî çil salê dawî de ronakbîriyekê mezin pêk hatiye, pêk anîye. Yani gel em karin bêjin di hundirê sî çel sala de sed sal gav avêtiyî. Yani îdî gel di nav vê pirsê de yê, di nav vê lêpirsînê de yê. û bi hewla xwe û bi hêza xwe Çîna serdest kom dibêjin an jî rêveber kare bi awayekî veguherîne saz bike. Ez dixwazim bêjim mesela demekê di navbêna tevgera azadiya gelê Kurd yê niha ku em bêjin hemdem pêkek em bi nav bikin û hêzên başûr de nakokî hebûn weke heta ki hat asta ku pevçûnekê pêk were. Her du hêl jî li gora xwe belkî sedemên wan hebû lê niha em karin bêjin ew tansiyon henekî ketiye em pê kêfxweşin lê sedemek wê jî ew bû ku ez difikirim gel destûr neda vê pevçûnê. Yani şerê di nav xweyî de şerê birakujî yan jî û zanin birîna me ya reş e gel gotin heger kîja hêz veya dest pê bike em wê hêzê efû nakin ew ê di dîrokê de weke çawan bêjin sûcdar bê pênasekirin. Em efû nakin û em qebûl nakin. Her du hêl jî di awayekî de pêş de neçûn. Yani hege dilê wan hebû jî pêş de neçûn an jî belkî berjewendî an jî lihevkirin hat wê astê. Elbet di vê pevçûnê de di vê lihevkirinê de dewleta Tirkiye, Îranê, ez ji we re bêjim dewletê Ereban e nakokiyê navxweyî ye û her wiha îstixbarata Tirkî û dewletên navnetewî di nav de ji bo ku Kurd nên gel hev. Yani Kurd yek bibe kêr yek bibe penêr hevdû jêkin gelek sedem hene. Ez vana jî tunen hesab nakim nabêjim bila şaşnê fêmkirin lê de encamê de em bibêjin. De encamê de hege li hember hev rabûnek hebe jî bi sekna gel ev pevçûn de astekê de sekinî pêş re neçû îja eveya ereniyeke eveya çi ye li gor dîtina min êdî gel tevlîvî karî dibe yani demokrasiyek eger dîtbar be jî pêktê hilbijartin pêktê îna mînak li başûr li rojava niha weke statûyek nediyar heye fiîlî em karin bêjin lê dûr de jî hilbijartin pêktê çi qasî li gora şert û mercan pêktê em nizanin li beled naverokê de gel îrada xwe hildibijêre fikr û ramanê xwe digihîne rê rayedarê xwe li bakur her wiha belkî rojhilat em karin bêjin hîna yani rexsinekî meşrûk û karibe xwe bîne ziman mixabin pêk nehatiye lê wexta em li eyaleta Kurdistanê dibînin newsa wan jî hilbijartiyên xwe an jî rêveberê xwe hilbijartin yani encamê de îradeya gel îro ro derketiye pêş di vir de em karibin em karin çi bikin em dibêjin ya dîsa dubare dikim ez dibêjim pirakê ji hêla jina de em karin saz bikin ji ber ku jin bi awayekî civakîne û di hêla civakê de hêstewarin yani hêst û hebûna jina di vir de li ser berjewendiyê gel saz dibin ew xalekê giring em karibin di navbêna jina de pirekê ava bikin û li ser vê pirê tişt ava bibin yadin rewşenbîr hunerbend û em karin bêjin nivîskarên me yani çîna me ya ronakbîr rastî jî ez çîna me yan jî kesên me yên ronakbîr ji her çarpeçê Kurdistanê ez bi erinî dibînim her çiqas fikrên siyasî êwan yê şexsî hebin jî nerînekê hevpar heye ji bo Kurdistanê gotuna dibêjin dilê wan li ser deşê ji Partî Demokrat be jî dîsa dibêjin Kurdistan PKK'yê jî dîsa dibêjin Kurdistan an jî derîndin yani çîna me ya rewşenbîra jî ya hunermenda jî ew xala hevpar em karibin ji wê xalê bigirin û di vê gotinê de di vê hevpariyê de em bên gel hev ne mecbûr e em de her xala de li hev bikin di fikrên bîrdozî de di fikrên em bêjin wekî diyê dinyayê nerîna dinyayê de di hilbijartiyên xwe de dibe ku em çepkir bin dibe ku em rastkir bin dibe ku em mütedeyîn bin qet ne girîng e ew xala ku em hevpar li hev dikin ya askarî müşterek dibêjin ya em wê askarî müşterek em karibin zeft bikin û bidin meşandin ya sêyemîn rayedarên Kurda ki karibin îkaza civakê hes bikin ji bo wan jî însiyatîv bêgirtin gotin bêkirin ne ku ez paqijim yêdin reşe yan jî bi rexneyên tund û rexneyên ku dijmintiyê an jî ez nabêjim dijmintî nabêna Kurda de ev gotin ez naxwazim ji devê me derkeve ew çawan bêjin ji hevcudabûnê hîn kûr bike wan ew zimanê tuj ya di çapemeniyê de têpkaranîn yani her çapemenî bijî ez rast nabînim û ez şaştî dibînim yani nabêna Kurda de ew bîrê ew wî zinarî hîn bêtir ji hev vedike gerek mere vana bibînî belkî ji wir de dest pê bike însiyatîfa ku bê stendin ku hişyariya bikin bêjin çapemenî nikarin vî zimanî bikarbînin çünkü ev ziman yekîtiyê jardadayî dike yani dîsam karin bêjin nerînên bîrdozî nên ser masa müzakereyê ew bîrdozî weke me got bîrdoziya herkesî heye li gora dîtina xwe ez xwedî fikrekim Nilay xanim xwedî fikreke an jî dersim hürmeta min gerek hebe her çiqas ez tevlê nebim jî mecbûr ez vê hürmetê saz bikim ji ber ku em nirxên demokrasiyê ji bo gelê xwe em mecbûrin em saz bikin ji bo ku sibê ro em neşibin serdestên xwe em neşibin kolonyalistên xwe ji niha de em karibin wêya tehammül û demokrasî û fikrên cûrbecûr em karibin di nav münaqeşeyekê bi sewiyê em karibin pêk bînin ew ji bo me muhîm e li hember vana em karibin rabin em rexne bikin binerin hêza gel û îro em bêjin civaka ser sosyal medya û ser tiştên din yani civak êdî tevlî gelek tişta dibin ha di vir de gotinên rast mere karibînin ziman rewşenbîrên me Karin analizên hîn xurttir bikin ku ev çawa zararê didime kîjan xala dem karibin hinekî xwe veguherînin. Jin hîn bêtir înisiyatîfê bigirin em jin xwe ji bîrdoziya partiyan, îdeolojiyan û hizban û nêzîkatiyên paşverû ve karibin xwe xelas bikin hîn bêtir bên gel hev. Ez dibêjim di vî barî de ew ê tiştin pêk were. û ya belkî Nilay xanim jî bîne ziman ez di hêla metod û bêjin rêw rêbaz jî hinek tiştin hene ku me re karî bikin mijara müzakereyê. Yani müzakere ne tenê nabêna dewleta de çê dibe, di nabêna xwe de jî çê dibe. Ji bo yekîtiya netewî em pêk bînin ku jiyana me û qedera me hinekî jî bi vê yekîtiyê ve girêdayî heger em pêk bînin em ê bi ser kevin, destkeftinê xwe biparêzin û hîn bên astekê bilindtir, belkî em karibin çar perça jî weke dewletekê jî an jî weke statûyekê Kurda ku êdî ji qatliyama û ji kuştinê û ji qirkirinê xelas bibin, weke însana bijîn, em jiyanekî vî rengî ji gelê xwe re saz bikin, an jî em vê sedsalê ji destê xwe berdin. Ev ya bi vê xalê ve girêdayî. Ne tenê helbet ev ama ya herî sereke ev yekîtiya nabêna me de yî. Ha di vir de wê çaxê em karin müzakereyan bikin. Müzakere çawa dibin? Evalno yani weke nabên çêtî çê dibin. Lewsa elçî derdikevin. Qasidên müzakereyan ku ji bo lehevkirinê pêk bînin pêk tên. Em karibin wan qasidana saz bikin. Yani mekanîzmayek û înisiyatîfek derkeve ku di nabêna Kurda de ev nakokên siyasî, ev nakokiyên ku hizbî û bîrdozî û her wiha yani fikrên beşerî em bibêjin, sebebên beşerî em bibêjin. Em wana karibin bypass bikin û di fikra netewî de û berjewendiyên gel yê hevpar de müzakereyê pêk bînin masayekê saz bikin û di vê masayê de em şert û mercan ji hevdû re bêjin, şert û mercan dînin û di hizûra canik û camêran de em karibin weke peymanekê navhev de pêk bînin. Ne ku bêjim ez zor didim bira gotina me bin na gotina her kesî be weke diya min dibêje gotina we bira mê be bira ne nêr be. Yani gotina mê nerme û zêde dibe. Gotina mê hîn zêdetir tifaqê çê dike. Em karibin bi gotina mê nêzîkî hev bibin ji bo wê rê û rêbazê müzakereyan ku îro ro bûye disiplînek ser rûyê dünyayê de. Ew disiplîn weke zanistiyekê êdî pêk tê. Metodên ku dibêjin senkronize gav avêtin, hevdû bawerî kirin, em bêjin garantör amade kirin, her wiha me re karibana weke piçûk bînin. Îro ro em bi dewleta Tirkî re ku bi hezaran însanê me kuştine em li ser masê wan re hevrûdinê newsa bahçelî niha bang dike tiştekî dibêjin em dibêjin bila be. Em ê li ser masê rûnên em ê dijminê me îma em ê bi kê re aş bibin. Hege em destê xwe dirêjî wan destana dikin wê çaxê em karin destê xwe dirêjî birayê xwe xwehê xwe jî bikin. Yani ev ji bo me gerek şermek bi ku em nikaribin li ser maseyekê rûnên û pirsgirêkê xwe li ser maseyekê çareser nekin. Vê bangê belkî bi vê münasebetê em bikin hem ji siyasetmedarên Kurd û hem ji zanist û rewşenbîrên Kurd, hunermendê Kurd, dayîkên û jinên Kurd em bikin ku îro roja sibê dereng e. Ez spas dikim.
Thank you, Selma. Nilay, maybe your comments on the question in the chat?
Yes, it's really hard to say anything after Selma Khan's remarks because she so excellently described the situation and came up with suggestions, obviously based on years of experience as a woman, as a politician. And it is really, I think this is what makes Kurdish society and different sectors of the Kurdish society, including like the politicians, very impressive, because despite going through like so much difficulties, they're still able to maintain a vision that is based on kindness, and that's based on respect and negotiation and dialogue. I think I have to say that I find that quite impressive. And the things that I want to say need to be like building off of what Selma said. Now, I think this is how I would like, and also I can't see having, this is like a wonderful question. This is kind of bringing together these two levels of analysis that I mentioned. One is like more descriptive, analytical, understanding the reality, and then working through it, finding ways to exist and finding ways to thrive and survive in the current circumstances. Now, I think while I was listening to Salman, I was also trying to kind of like have an answer to this like practical question of how do we achieve unity? Because the reality, as we mentioned at the beginning of our event here, is dividedness. But dividedness is not just emotional. Dividedness is not just cultural or linguistic. Dividedness, real, physical. It's spatial, because Kurdistan was divided as a territory, but there is also like Kurdish diaspora is one of the biggest diaspora communities in Europe right now. What I mean by this is rootlessness and kind of cutting the links between various Kurdish populations who have a claim to land, and itself has been an ongoing policy in the past century or so. Now, considering this, I think one thing that I really want to emphasize here is changing our everyday language about how we talk about Kurds and Kurdistan and the land itself. Because as an academic, I can perhaps give you this example, because like Kurdish studies proliferated in the past decade or so, but mostly talking about Kurdish, the issues related to Kurds and Kurdistan as a question, as a problem. When in its best form, it is talked about as a nation state issue, as a minority question, as a minority problem, citizenship. These might be correct depending on your perspective. But I think one thing that we have to consistently emphasize is the fact that Kurdistan is the historic homeland of Kurds, and they have a historic right to it, even though it is divided right now. So we have to really change our language when we talk about this. It's not just a citizenship issue. It's not just a minority issue. Yes, it is, because we live under different nation states. But the important thing that we have to emphasize in our everyday language and in our political discourses is that Kurds are the indigenous population to their historic land. And I think that perseverance and survival stems from that. And we have to change that language and emphasize the coloniality of historic Kurdistan and the Kurdish right to the territory itself. I think changing the language itself is really important. The other thing is, how do we, on the one hand, there is the reality of dividedness, and the real manifestation of dividedness is, Kurds in Iran, they speak a different dialect, or in Bashur, in Bakur, there are language differences. But not just that. I mean, they were, situated in different nation state cultural contexts. What I mean by this is, the reality is that for a Kurdish person from Bakur, culturally, they might really be closer to a Turkish person from Bakur than another Kurdish person in Iran, or might not. But this is quite also like a part of the reality that we have to face with. And in relation to what Salman said, we have to recognize that reality, and we have to embrace that reality. That Kurdishness now in 2024, in the 21st century, comes in so many different faces. It comes in so many different manifestations. It comes in so many different life experiences. And the question of unity needs to be based on this assumption that, yes, nation state colonialism created different types of Kurdish subjectivities. But this does not mean that we have to exclude these different subjectivities, or we have to have a one standard recipe for what Kurdishness is, what Kurdishness entails. Kurdishness entails so many different experiences right now. And I think if we want to have this conversation about unity, we have to come to terms with that. That nation-state context created different Kurdish political identities, subjectivities, and positionalities. And that goes back to Salman's previous point. Yes, for Kurdish political entities, they do negotiate with different states, different actors, different political structures. And we have to adopt the same approach. We have to be able to talk to each other. We have to be able to communicate, negotiate, and respect. And this is what we call like the politics of care in a way. We sometimes are we afford grace and kindness to those outside of the Kurdish community, but we don't afford the same kindness and same understanding and same respect to those within the Kurdish community. And this is not really specific to Kurds. It is like a phenomenon that most colonized societies went through, you know, the outsider having to deal with it all the time. So there is like a historical reason for that, why Kurds sometimes are not as generous towards each other than they are actually to the outsiders. So this is something I think that we have to adopt consciously and over again in all microspaces. Like Salman mentioned, it in microspaces in the academia, we are all working on it. For better or worse, we are consciously working on respecting or being more generous, being more kind, or being more respectful towards other Kurds who might come in from so many different backgrounds, right? And for instance, the issue of language, for a Kurdish person's experience and relationship with language in Turkey is very different from a Bashar Kurd's experience or an Eastern Kurdistan, Roshilati's Kurds experiences, because they were exposed to different political systems. And I have to say, Turkish state's policies towards Kurdish language, I would readily describe as the harshest among all of them. Now, so if Kurdishness now and this age comes in so many different ways, it is upon us to make sure that we extend the same understanding and same generosity and same kindness to our peers, that we're really not, it's so easy for us to be kind and to be understanding to outsiders, but not always to each other. And I think Selma Hanım also mentioned that. And the other thing is the question specifically mentions like politics, arts, etc. And Selma Hanım covered the politics aspect of it. But like all these spaces, academia and like arts, cinema, in all of these spaces, I think maintaining this conscious alertness about we are a colonized society and we have a right to this territory consistently without giving up and without really respecting and understanding different Kurdish subjective positionalities. This might be tiring because everybody comes with their own baggage, but at the same time, if we have to talk about unity in face of nation-state fragmentedness, this I think takes conscious effort. And looking at the history of like Kurdish political movements in the past 3-4 decades, I see so much progress made thanks to the people's efforts and people's struggles. But we also have so much to do in all these sectors, from education to like the family, to everyday life, gender relations, academia, cultural production. And one question, of course, is like language. How can Kurdish language be an integral part of all of these discussions that we are having right now? How can we prioritize it? How can we put this on top of our to-do list when we talk about this vision of political unity?
Thank you very much, dear Nilay and dear Selma. Are there any other questions from the participants? There's no other question in the chat. Then I think we can finish today's panel. Thank you very much, dear Selma and dear Nilay for joining us today, for your excellent remarks. We hope to continue this format, the Science Café, because it's important that science always meets practice, that we try to achieve solutions from the controversies, and I'm sure this panel contributed to the issue. So thank you very much, and looking very much forward to see you again soon. Bye.
Gerek spas.
Gerek spas. Çok teşekkürler. Çok memnun oldum tanıştığımıza.
Aynı şekilde stream'i bitirdim.